Okay, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to be talking about SPSS Statistics, a software program developed by IBM originally for statistics. And this, I'd say, is one of the most common stats programs in social sciences, and certainly in psychology. When I was an undergraduate, this was the first stats program I was ever trained on. I think a lot of people have had similar experiences. Um, yeah, and so I'll talk more about advantages and disadvantages later in the video. But first, let's dive on in here. And actually, I'll go ahead and close it and show you what it's like to open it from scratch. So here we're opening it. And here we can see we can open existing data sources. Yeah, and tell you what, I'm going to do this one. Okay, so now I have my data. And so first, let me show you the Excel document we're working with. So this is the data that I want to use. This data is actually something that my sister shared with me. It was a project she was doing a few years back. Yeah, long story short, she works as a cultural anthropologist. She's done work with an organization called United Stateless, which helps stateless individuals, people who don't have any formal nation. For example, in the 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of people who were part of the Soviet Union who were citizens and then were in other countries at the time of the collapse, all of a sudden they didn't have a nation, right? And so they've never really been able, or many of them haven't been able to get citizenship elsewhere because their nation just vanished kind of overnight. And so this is some example data from a survey that organization did several years back. So I won't go into the nitty-gritty of it for the sake of not oversharing. But just a general example of what this looks like. So you can see we have our variables and columns and then all this data. And so in SPSS, when we go to data view, we can see basically just that, right? This is what it looks like in Excel. And then in SPSS, we also have variable view. And so basically that is taking all these columns, all these variables, and letting us look at that information, right? And so we can see here, part ID, code, consent, age are the first four. Part ID, code, consent, that one's kind of smushed, and age, right? And so this we can play with our variables and do different things. Yeah, and so we can set our values, right? So if, say it's a survey and they can respond in different ways, like there's different bubbles or boxes they can check. We can see those values here. So if they check the first box, it meant good response. Second box meant this, so on and so forth. And then there's just lots of things we can do. Some of this we haven't really gone far enough in the course yet to fully explain. But again, that's not the point here. The point is just to introduce it to you. So yeah, so we have our data here. Let's see, show you a couple other things. Well, first, like I said, it's point and click, right? So we have all these commands up here. This is one of those things that it's really overwhelming and it takes a lot of, I'd say, years of experience to really get familiar with what everything is here. But we can see all kinds of different stuff that we can do. I'll come back to that. First, I want to show you what the what something else looks like here. Okay, let me pull up. Okay, so this here, this window that I just opened, this is the syntax, right? So in RStudio, we had scripts. This is kind of the equivalent of a script, right? And actually, this one's pretty complicated. Let me open a simpler one to hopefully make this a little more straightforward. So just as a very basic example here, there's a lot to take in. I apologize for that. Let me move some of this down so it's less overwhelming for you. In a basic sense here, we can type in commands and execute them that can do different things with our data. So in a very basic sense, let's say I wanted to change part ID here to be, yo, what up, students? Because I'm just a cool cat. Right, so if I do that, now a new window pops up. This is output, right? And so this is kind of like the console in RStudio. This is telling us, okay, what just happened? There's no error codes here, so I'm going to assume that's a good thing. And now when we go back, okay, we changed the label, and now it says, yo, what up, students? right? So it's kind of a basic example of how syntax works, right? And we can get more elaborate with it, like this here, lots of different analyses that you can type out, or you can paste, so you can point and click and tell it to do something, and then click paste, and it will paste the code here so you can see the code and save it for later use. But let's do a real simple thing. Let's say I wanted to see, we have this variable here, country born. What country were you born in? Let's look at what people said. So I want to, let's see, it's called country born. And I just want to see a basic output of that, right? So what are the results when people were asked what country were they born in? Okay, and so we can see what people said, right? What country were you born in? Then backing up, this is our output again, right? This window popped up with the results of our analysis. So we can see some were born in Bahamas, Ethiopia, Greece. We can see our frequencies. So one person was born in Bahamas, one in Ethiopia. We can see more columns here, what percent of the data were responding in different ways, right? Yeah, again, I don't want to go any further than that, but a very basic sense of how this works, right? We have our data, and then we can point and click and tell it to do different commands, or we can use our syntax and type out commands. And it really kind of comes down to personal preference on what you want to do with it. Yeah, and so that's SPSS in a nutshell. I'm sure there's a lot more we could go into, but I don't want to go in too much depth. So I'll talk about advantages and disadvantages here. One advantage, as you can see, it's, I think, a little bit more approachable than RStudio because you can point and click, and there are different windows that pop up. So it just feels, to me, it feels a little bit less intimidating than just one window with all these different things happening where you have to type in all this fancy code. So if you don't know anything about code, you can still use this and point and click and get it to do things. So it's definitely approachable. But one major disadvantage is that it costs money, and it costs a lot of money. It's a proprietary program, which means that someone owns it and you have to pay them in order to use it. And it's one of those things where as the years go by and it gets more expensive, a lot of people are starting to reconsider if it's worth it. And I'd say that's one of the reasons we've seen this emergence of open source software packages. So in a very basic sense, I'd say those are the main pros and cons. Major con is the cost, but a major pro is that it's pretty user-friendly once you get the hang of it. And there's a whole lot that you can do with it. But on the flip side, there's also new free programs that are even more user-friendly than this, right? Because this feels user-friendly to me, but I've been using it for over like 12 years. Whereas if this is the first time you've ever seen it, this probably doesn't make a lick of sense, right? You don't know what all these different terms mean, right? And so there's definitely a learning curve associated with it that some other new free programs are trying to get around. And so we'll kind of talk about those in some other videos, and we'll leave this one at that. See you next time.